5th of January, 1945. Kamikazes attack U.S. Navy. In the 13th century, a storm destroyed Kublai Khan's fleet and saved Japan. This divine wind, or kamikaze, now gave name to the suicide squadrons hurled against Allied fleets, yet again to save the empire. Kamikaze pilots killed more than 1,000 American servicemen and sank or damaged some 50 U.S. naval vessels when they attacked a fleet en route to land on Luzon in the Philippines. The kamikaze pilots' ultimate sacrifice, though initially successful, was, however, too little, too late, and the divine wind did not prove the savior in the 20th century. Tenth of January, 1945. U.S. Sixth Army lands on Luzon. General MacArthur had famously promised to return to the Philippines, and Luzon and Manila was obviously the main prize. A large American fleet had assembled off Lingayen Gulf to support the invasion of Luzon, though they experienced severe kamikaze attacks which killed over 1,000 American servicemen and sank or damaged nearly 50 ships. 4 Division of the U.S. Sixth Army, under the command of General Kruger, poured ashore on the 10th of January against little opposition. The Japanese had pushed south towards Manila to improve their defensive position, and it would take several weeks before the Americans could secure the important Clark airfield. 12th of January, 1945. Soviet Winter Offensive. In the beginning of 1945, the Soviet armies were only 80 kilometers from Berlin and were about to launch its largest push yet. The Soviet forces were impressive. 11 Guards armies, 6 tank armies, 5 shock armies, and 46 infantry or cavalry armies, supported by 13 air armies. This gave the Red Army commander a superiority in every aspect of military strength over the 200 German and Hungarian divisions facing them. The Wehrmacht's only advantage was the hatred and fear of the Mongol hordes, hardly sufficient to stop this final drive towards the German capital. 18th of January, 1945. Germans drive through Soviet forces to reach the Danube. The Germans were retreating steadily on the Eastern Front and had been driven out of all Soviet territories by early 1945. Their armies in the south were at risk of being cut off, and a counteroffensive was launched to try to break through to the River Danube. It was a last-ditch effort by the Germans, and the fighting was exceptionally fierce. Despite shortage of equipment, fuel for the few remaining panzers, inadequate supply line, and hardly any air cover, the Germans did manage to break through the Soviet lines, earning a temporary reprieve. This was to be the last substantial German counteroffensive on the Eastern Front. 19th of January, 1945. Soviet forces capture Krakow. 2 days after Polish troops attached to the Red Army had taken Warsaw, Soviet forces captured the city of Krakow, 270 kilometers to the south of the river Vistula. Though Krakow was of considerable strategical importance to the Germans, it was not particularly heavily defended. This could, of course, be due to the fact that the Red Army already had crossed the Vistula River further north. As so many times during the Soviet offensives on the Eastern Front, the main thrust was left to the tank divisions and their superb T-34s. Though the Germans in the Panther and the Royal Tiger had panzers that could match the Russians, it was a question of too little, too late. 21st of January, 1945. Soviet forces take Tannenberg. The objective for the Red Army at the northern sector of the Eastern Front was to reach the Baltic Sea. The 2 Soviet generals, Chernikovsky and Rokossovsky, coordinated their forces, allowing for the 2-pronged drive towards the coast. Rokossovsky attacked across the Narew and sent 2 armies to link up with Chernikowski at Königsberg. After 3 days of bitter fighting, the German defensive shell was broken and tank armies were fed in and raced ahead, breaking through the gap at Tannenberg on 21st of January, 1945. A week later, the Soviets reached the Baltic, cutting off the large German garrison at Königsberg. 23rd of January, 1945. U.S. Fifth Army takes St. Vith. During the Battle of the Bulge had been created by an aggressive German counteroffensive across the Ardennes into Belgium. The initial German drive with the 6th Panzer Army, 5th Panzer Army, and 7th Army had advanced some 70 kilometers, approaching their main target, the port of Antwerp. The fast push made the Germans vulnerable on their flanks, and U.S. forces pushed north from close to the Belgian-French border and managed to relieve Bastogne and take the important road junction of Saint-Vith, a turning point in the campaign which turned out to be Hitler's last offensive in the West. 28th of January 1945. Last of the Ardennes salient is flattened. The earlier German offensive across the Ardennes had given the Allied leaders a nasty jolt, particularly considering the speed and purpose of Manteuffel's and Sepp Dietrich's panzers that almost penetrated through to their target of Antwerp. However, outstanding Allied commanders such as America's General George Patton and England's Field Marshal Sir Bernard Montgomery had thwarted the Germans' effort and regained all lost territory. 28th of January 1944, the Ardennes salient was completely flattened by the Allies, and the Germans never recovered from the loss of material and manpower that could have been better deployed on the other side of the Rhine. 31st of January 1945. Zhukov reaches the Oder River. After the fall of Warsaw and Krakow, Marshal Zhukov's troops literally raced across the rest of Poland and into Germany. In the process, they brushed aside several temporary German defenses thrown in their way and blockaded Poznan on the 25th of January. By the last day of the month, Zhukov had reached the River Oder near Kustrin, where he managed to cross and form a bridgehead on the west bank. The Red Army now controlled a front on the Oder that stretched from opposite Berlin down to the Carpathians, a distance of more than 800 kilometers, and Soviet artillery fire could easily be heard in Berlin's main shopping street, Unter den Linden. 1st of February 1945. U.S. 6th Army drives towards Manila. U.S. forces on Luzon in the Philippines were facing a major task in trying to secure the Clark airfield. It was, at the same time, important to secure the capital of Manila, and General MacArthur had landed an infantry force on the Bataan Peninsula to cut off the Japanese. MacArthur had also put the 11th Airborne Division ashore to the south of Manila. So by the 1st of February 1945, the city was under threat, both from the north and the south. Though Manila's fate was sealed, the Americans advanced with caution, as many prominent buildings were known to house Allied prisoners, including women and children. 3rd of February 1945. U.S. raids Berlin. The Allied High Command was well aware that Berlin itself would be defended with more determination than anything they had ever faced before, and that it would be important to soften the target. The B-17s was, throughout the war, the Americans' outstanding bomber aircraft, deployed both in Europe and in the Pacific. When on 3rd of February 1945, 1,000 of them took to the air heading for Berlin, they were escorted by almost 900 fighters, though the B-17's armament made it more than a match for any enemy fighter. This raid on the German capital was the biggest the Allies had launched so far, and was spectacularly successful, with comparatively few American casualties. 4th of February 1945, start of the Yalta Conference. The Yalta Conference, starting on the 4th of February 1945, between President Roosevelt, Prime Minister Winston Churchill, and Premier Joseph Stalin, marked the high point of Allied unity. The conference was devoted to the formulation of military strategy and to negotiations on political problems. A communiqué, known as the Yalta Declaration, stated that it was the Allied intention to destroy German militarism and Nazism and to ensure that Germany never again be able to disturb the peace of the world, to bring all war criminals to just and swift punishment, and to exact reparation in kind for the destruction wrought by the Germans. 10th of February 1945. U.S. First Army captures Schwamenau Dam. In order for the Allies to get to the Rhine, they first have to cross the River Roer in eastern Holland. A number of dams, 7 in all, held back 111 million cubic meters of water, and any crossing of the Roer would only be possible if this water could let out. The U.S. First Army started towards the Roer Dam, sweeping aside what little opposition they encountered, but when, on the 10th of February 1945, they took the last one, they found that German engineers had efficiently sabotaged the valves and that it would be a long wait before the water had drained into the North Sea. "12th of February 1945, last day of the Yalta Conference. The Yalta Conference between Prime Minister Winston Churchill, President Franklin D. Roosevelt, and Premier Joseph Stalin came to a close on the 12th of February 1945. In addition to the official Yalta Declaration, references were also made to a decision to divide Germany into 3 zones of occupation to be governed through a Central Control Commission. Another important agreement reached at Yalta, but not disclosed at the time, provided for the Soviet Union to declare war on Japan 90 days after the end of the war in Europe, and to receive the southern half of Sakhalin Island, the Kuril Islands, and privileges on China's mainland. 23rd of February 1945. Stars and Stripes is raised over Iwo Jima. The island of Iwo Jima was of considerable strategical importance in the Allies' drive towards Tokyo. The U.S. Marines' landing on the 19th was preceded by 72 days of heavy naval and Air Force bombardment. The Japanese mounted a bitter defense, and it would take almost 4 days before the Marines could raise the Stars and Stripes over Mount Suribachi, an event now remembered by one of the most famous photographs in history. It was to take a further 32 days to conquer Iwo Jima, and of the 23,000 Japanese stationed on the island, only 216 were taken prisoners, and most of those were wounded. 24th of February 1945. U.S. forces in control of Manila. Though Manila theoretically was an open city, the Japanese Rear Admiral Iwabuchi, commanding 17,000 naval troops there, was intent on turning Manila into a second Stalingrad, despite orders to the contrary from Yamashita. Almost every building became a minor fort, and the city had to be pounded into a shambles by American bombing and artillery fire. There was fighting for almost every street and house, and when finally, on the 24th of February 1945, the 16th century fort Intramuros fell, every Japanese inside had been killed, and practically every wall had been reduced to rubble. 7th of March 1945. The bridge at Remagen is taken. The Rhine was, by early March 1945, the last major obstacle for the Allied advance into Germany itself. Cologne had been taken on the 6th of March, and preparations were being made to build pontoon bridges across the river. But to the astonishment of the Allies and the inexpressible fury of Adolf Hitler, the U.S. First Army managed to take the bridge at Remagen undamaged. Fortunately, auxiliary bridges were still being built downstream from the Remagen, so when the weakened bridge keeled over some time later, killing 28 U.S. engineers, the important bridgehead on the east bank was not cut off from vital supplies. 14th of March 1945. U.S. Third Army crosses the Moselle. After driving the German panzer divisions out of Belgium during the Battle of the Bulge a few months earlier, General Patton had turned his Third U.S. Army around and was aiming for the German heartland. The first obstacle is the Meuse, or Moselle River. It was, however, not the first time Patton had done battle in this area. As a young cavalry officer, he had commanded a tank division in the Meuse-Argonne battles, where he was wounded. This time he was luckier, and he and his army made it through to the river with remarkably few casualties. On the 14th of March 1945, the U.S. Third Army then crossed the Meuse and could start the famous drive towards Berlin. 14th of March 1945. U.S. Third Army crosses the Moselle. After driving the German panzer divisions out of Belgium during the Battle of the Bulge a few months earlier, General Patton had turned his 3rd U.S. Army around and was aiming for the German heartland. The first obstacle is the Meuse, or Moselle River. It was, however, not the first time Patton had done battle in this area. As a young cavalry officer, he had commanded a tank division in the Meuse-Argonne battles, where he was wounded. This time he was luckier, and he and his army made it through to the river with remarkably few casualties. On the 14th of March 1945, the U.S. Third Army then crossed the Meuse and could start the famous drive towards Berlin. 16th of March 1945. Iwo Jima finally falls. The American Marines had famously raised the Stars and Stripes on top of Mount Suribachi on the island of Iwo Jima on the 23rd of February 1945, but the Japanese were to defend the island with fanaticism for weeks to come. Time after time, the Marines moved in behind a devastating artillery and airstrike barrage, only to be met by fierce resistance. It wasn't until the 9th of March that the first Marine patrols reached the northeast shore of the island, thereby gaining control, and on the 16th of March, Iwo Jima was, to all intents and purposes, in the hands of the Americans, though pockets of resistance were still to be cleared up. 19th of March 1945, Japanese driven out of Mandalay. The British forces in Burma were pressing south, and by the 3rd of March 1945, their 17th Division had reached Mektila, more than 100 kilometers south of Mandalay. At the same time, the 33rd Corps were closing down on Mandalay and its fortress, Fort Dufferin. The terrain around Mandalay was difficult, which made it easy for a comparatively small Japanese rearguard to defend the city. But eventually, the Japanese situation proved hopeless. At the start of the campaign, they only mustered 21,000 men, and by the 19th of March, Mandalay fell, and the last survivors were driven out of Fort Dufferin the following day. 22nd of March 1945. U.S. Third Army establishes bridgehead south of Mainz. The U.S. Third Army under General Patton had again moved forward with unusual speed. He had crossed the Meuse River on the 14th of March and reached the vicinity of Mainz, 150 kilometers to the east, within a week, and General Patton thought a crossing could be achieved without further support. The divisional commander protested about the short time available for preparation, but Patton insisted, and on the 22nd of March, he sent the first wave of assault boats across the 300-meter-wide river. As most things Patton engaged in, the assault was successful, and the Americans established an important bridgehead south of Mainz. 23rd of March 1945, across the Rhine. The crossing of the Rhine by the Allied main force was going to be a major undertaking, and it had in fact been planned already the previous year. And the Allies were taking no chances. Their air forces completely neutralized what was left of the Luftwaffe, and new railheads brought up 662 tanks, 4,000 tank transporters, and 32,000 other vehicles. The crossing began on the night of the 23rd of March 1945, under heavy artillery fire. The opposition was patchy, though fierce in places, and the Allies were able to wade ashore and establish a sizable bridgehead, but there was more to come. 24th of March 1945. 14,000 British and U.S. troops dropped at the Wesel. The Allies had cleared Wesel of enemy troops, but there was still a possibility of a German counterattack in that area, which had to be prevented at all cost. At midday on the 24th of March 1945, an air armada flew over the Rhine and dropped British and American paratroopers in a number that darkened the sky. They were soon followed by troop-carrying gliders. In all, 14,000 Allied troops were landed and prevented any meaningful German counterattack. The casualties were high amongst the glider pilots, 25%. But at nightfall, the Rhine bridgehead was secure, despite some localized German resistance. 26th of March 1945. Last Japanese survivors on Iwo Jima launch Banzai attack. Even though the U.S. Marines had been in control of Iwo Jima for some time, there were still small pockets of Japanese resistance in some parts of the island. The Marines had had to work hard to clean up, using flamethrowers to force the remaining Japanese out of their underground tunnels. They were fighting an enemy for whom becoming prisoner of war wasn't an option. On the 26th of March, the remaining Japanese troops launched a suicidal banzai attack against far too heavy odds. When the final Japanese resistance had died down, there was only just over 200 Japanese soldiers alive on the island, and they were wounded. 27th of March 1945. U.S. 1st and 3rd Armies meet near Koblenz. The U.S. 3rd Army had captured Koblenz on the 17th of March 1945, and on the 27th they link up with the U.S. 1st Army just outside the city. During this period, the towns of Boppard, St. Goar, Worms, and Mainz were also taken, and by the end of the month, both Darmstadt and Wiesbaden were in the hands of the Americans. Whilst armored columns were driven towards Frankfurt am Main, a huge Allied bridgehead was formed from Bonn down to Mannheim, from which the last Western offensive could be launched, designed to meet the Red Army on the Elbe and split Germany in two. 28th of March 1945. General Eisenhower announces that the Allies' first target is Dresden. The Allied forces had now established a strong bridgehead on the east bank of the Rhine and were preparing for the last drive towards Berlin. And on the 28th of March 1945, General Dwight D. Eisenhower announces that the next main target would be the cities of Dresden and Leipzig with their vital industrial regions. The task was given to the U.S. 12th Army Group, whilst in the north, Montgomery's 21st Army Group were ordered to drive towards Hamburg. The Canadians would protect the left flank by clearing Holland and drive along the coast through Emden and Wilhelmshaven. Germany was being seriously squeezed. The 1st of April 1945, 325,000 German troops encircled in the Ruhr. The Allied crossing of the Rhine took the Germans by surprise, since the river was seen by many commanding officers as an almost impenetrable barrier and a protector of the fatherland. Since the Allied were advancing east at speed, it was inevitable that pockets of Germans might be left behind. But on the 1st of April 1945, when the U.S. 1st and 9th Armies linked up at Lippstadt, some 125 kilometers east of the Rhine as the crow flies, it was a little more than a pocket that was left behind. By their swift maneuvers, the Americans had managed to encircle virtually the whole of the Ruhr, and 325,000 German troops were trapped. 4th of April 1945. Germans leave Hungary. On the Eastern Front, things were going from bad to worse for the Germans during the spring of 1945. The Red Army had the upper hand on all sections of the front, from north to south. In Hungary, fierce battles were fought by the 2nd and 3rd Ukrainian armies when German and Hungarian armies tried hard to relieve the forces trapped in Budapest. During March, the 6th SS Panzer Army had attacked around Lake Balaton in an action not dissimilar to the Ardennes offensive, and with more or less the same outcome. By the 19th of March, the SS were fleeing back over the Austrian border, and by the 4th of April, German forces had had to completely abandon Hungary. The 5th of April, 1945. Patton is 100 kilometers east of the Rhine after fast advance. The U.S. 3rd Army, under the continued command of General Patton, was still forging ahead into the heart of Germany and had, by the 5th of April 1945, reached a point more than 100 kilometers east of their crossing point on the Rhine. It might be argued that he could have moved even faster, but General Eisenhower, supported by President Roosevelt, did not find it desirable for the Americans to reach Berlin first. He felt that the German capital was an easier target for the Russians, and the Soviet Union would prove cooperative in regard to post-war European responsibilities. There is little doubt that Joseph Stalin would have been amused had he been aware of this argument. 12th of April 1945. President Roosevelt dies. President Franklin Delano Roosevelt died on the 12th of April 1945 in Warm Springs, Georgia, of a cerebral hemorrhage. He was 63 years of age and had been the United States President since 1933. Roosevelt's presidency had been the most significant in the 20th century, from the end of the Depression with the New Deal through the declaration of war against Japan to the combined Allied D-Day invasion, difficult and turbulent times. Sadly, this much-loved president did not see the end of the war, and hence the fruits of many difficult decisions he'd had to take, but was mourned by a grateful nation that was well aware of the significance of their loss. 14th of April 1945. U.S. and British forces launched drive towards the Po River. The spring offensive in Italy had begun on the 9th of April 1945, with both the U.S. 5th and British 8th Armies heading towards Bologna. The 5th Army took Bologna, and, as the British had already broken through at the Argenta Gap, the route towards the River Po was open. The German commander-in-chief, Fiedenhof, had only skeleton reserves and couldn't expect support from the north after the defeat at the Battle of the Bulge. Against orders from Hitler, Fiedenhof ordered all German and pro-German forces to retreat. Now that the Allies had broken through to the open ground beyond the Po, the chances of stopping the advance amounted to 0. 16th of April 1945. Soviet offensive from Bridgehead on the Oder. The Soviet armies had established bridgeheads on the River Oder in early April 1945, and the 1st Belorussia Front, commanded by Marshal Zhukov, were poised for the assault on Berlin. In the early morning of the 16th of April, the two Soviet fronts open up an intense artillery barrage on the German positions. When the bombardment ceased, the tanks moved forward, the T-34s and IS-2s, with infantry squads riding on their hulls, machine guns and grenades ready to overpower the by now shattered German defenses. By the 18th of April, the Red Army was through the Oder defenses, and within days shells were falling on the outskirts of Berlin. 17th of April 1945. British troops liberate the KZ camp at Bergen-Belsen. The full horrors of the Holocaust could never be adequately described, so when British troops arrived at the Bergen-Belsen camp in central Germany on the 17th of April 1945, the shock of what they saw was profound. The impact of the gas chambers disguised as baths, the ovens, and the stench of burnt corpses was only overshadowed by the depravity that was evidenced in the wrecks of humanity that were the survivors. The outrage was overwhelming, and the British commander forced the mayor and citizens of the town to participate in the cleaning up and burial of the hundreds of corpses not yet gone to the ovens. The 19th of April 1945. U.S. First Army takes Halle and Leipzig. On the 19th of April 1945, the Red Army was only a stone's throw from Berlin itself. The capture of the German capital had been left to the Soviets as a joint decision between President Roosevelt and General Eisenhower. While Zhukov's and Konev's forces were shelling Berlin, the U.S. First Army took the citizens of Halle and Leipzig, some 120 kilometers southwest of Berlin. Despite the fact that the Germans were concentrated on the defense of their capital, the Allies did not have it all their own way. Both Halle, and in particular Leipzig, were heavily defended, slowing down the push considerably. In addition, the Allied supply lines were now stretched to the limit. The 20th of April 1945. U.S. 7th Army reaches Nuremberg. A couple of hundred kilometers south of the Americans' main drive towards Berlin, the U.S. 7th Army was moving into the Bavarian heartland and the city of Nuremberg, the site of Nazi Party rallies in the 30s, and later to attain world renown for the post-war war crimes trials. As a major center for the production of engines for aircraft, tanks, and submarines, the city had already been seriously damaged by Allied air raids. Nuremberg fell to the Americans on the 20th of April 1945, and the Allies were now in control of most of Bavaria, considered by many the home of National Socialism. 21st of April 1945. Zhukov's 8th Army reaches southeast suburbs of Berlin. The Soviet forces facing the German defenders of Berlin were awesome. Marshals Zhukov and Konev commanded 1,640,000 men, 41,600 guns, 6,300 tanks, and 8,400 aircraft. Opposing this might, the Germans had 7 panzer and 65 infantry divisions. Despite their precarious military situation, the Germans defended their capital with blind ferocity, but to no avail. On the 21st of April 1945, Marshal Zhukov's Eighth Army entered the city, and it was now only a matter of time before Berlin would finally succumb. 23rd of April 1945. U.S. Eighth Army captured Cebu in the Philippines. General MacArthur had indeed returned. On the 28th of February 1945, he had re-established the Philippine Commonwealth government in Manila, and by the end of March, the centers of communication and administrations were beyond Japanese control. But there was still work to do. The Japanese were holding out on many of the islands in the Philippines, including Cebu, approximately 580 kilometers southeast of Manila. The island was bombed intensely by both the U.S. Navy and the U.S. Air Force, and on the 23rd of April, Cebu fell to the U.S. Eighth Army after a reasonably brief confrontation of land forces. The 24th of April 1945. Soviet forces surround Berlin. While Marshal Zhukov was fighting the Germans in Berlin's southeastern suburbs, his colleague, Marshal Konev, had thrown his own forces into a drive due west towards the Elbe. By the 20th of April, he had reached Luckenwald. Konev now drove 2 more armies, given to him by Stavka, up towards Potsdam, and the German capital was completely surrounded by Red Army forces by the 24th of April, and the day after, he linked up with Zhukov's Guard tank armies, which now had come around the north of Berlin. Remarkably, the Germans still fought on, and it would indeed be several days before their forces finally surrendered. 25th of April 1945. Soviet and American troops meet on the Elbe at Torgau. On the 25th of April 1945, units of the Soviet 5th Guards Army reached the River Elbe at Torgau and were within minutes exchanging drinks, cigarettes, buttons, and photographs with American GIs of the U.S. First Army. The scenes of triumphant comradeship and cooperation which followed were repeated up and down the central axis of Germany, as soldiers who had fought their way there from Stalingrad met up with other soldiers who had fought their way through France and Germany from the beaches of Normandy. Germany was defeated, though it would be some time before the fact was realized by the German fighting forces themselves. The 26th of April 1945. Fierce Japanese resistance on Okinawa. The U.S. 10th Army, under the command of General Simon Bolivar Buckner, had landed on Okinawa on the 1st of April 1945 in what was the largest amphibious attack yet mounted in the Pacific. The Japanese Navy launched its last major operation of the war, a large-scale kamikaze attack involving the battleship Yamamoto. U.S. air attack on the Yamamoto appeared to have little effect, though it absorbed hit after hit, but finally the punishment became too severe and she sank. On land, fierce defending stopped General Buckner breaking through, and his 10th Army battered futilely at the Shuri line, but still the Japanese held out. The 28th of April 1945. Mussolini executed. Head of the SS in Italy, Karl Wolff, and Alan Dulles of the U.S. Office of Strategical Services in Switzerland had met early in 1945 on neutral grounds to discuss the possibility of a peace negotiation. On the 25th of April, after long and difficult negotiations, orders were given to German and fascist forces to lay down their arms on the 2nd of May. This was the only negotiated peace of the war in Europe, and spurred Benito Mussolini on to try and leave the country, but he was spotted and captured on the 28th of April near the Swiss border by communist partisans. The execution of Il Duce followed swiftly, and his corpse was hanged upside down in the local square. The 29th of April 1945. Hitler marries Eva Braun. Eva Braun, 21 years Adolf Hitler's junior, had been associated with the Führer for years. They had met when Fräulein Braun had been secretary to Hitler's photographer and personal friend Hoffmann. Unlike many women in the lives of powerful men, Eva Braun had little or no influence on Hitler's political life and spent long periods in Berchtesgaden, Hitler's Bavarian retreat, entertaining friends and guests. On the 29th of April 1945, with the Russian army knocking on the door, Hitler finally married Eva Braun. The ceremony took place in the air raid shelter of the Chancellery, with only the Goebbels in attendance. The 30th of April 1945, Hitler commits suicide. By the 30th of April 1945, Germany was completely overrun by her enemies, and though the bunker under the Chancellery still held out, it was only a matter of hours, or at best days, before Soviet forces would penetrate this last stronghold of the once mighty Third Reich. The occupants were only too aware that they could expect little mercy once captured, and Adolf Hitler and his wife of one day, Eva Braun, decided to commit suicide. The circumstances of how are not quite clear, but it seems certain that their bodies were taken above ground, doused in petrol, and burnt by Hitler's chauffeur. One of the most shameful eras in human history had come to an end. The 1st of May, 1945. Hammer and sickle flag is raised over the old Reichstag building in Berlin. On the 1st of May, 1945, Marshal Zhukov and his forces were well inside the center of Berlin and was approached by the chief of the German General Staff, General Krebs, under a white flag of truce. With almost unbelievable cheek, the German officers opened the conversation with the remark, "Today is the 1st of May, a great day for both our nations." Zhukov showed great restraint when he replied, "We have a great holiday today. How things are with you is less easy to say." It was, however, the first move to end the hostilities in Europe, and the hammer and sickle flag was raised over the old Reichstag building. The 2nd of May, 1945. Karl Wolff signs surrender of German troops in Italy. Berlin surrenders. It had already been agreed between SS General Karl Wolff and the American official John Dulles at the end of April that all German troops supporting the Germans in Italy would lay down their arms on the 2nd of May, 1945. On that very day, the actual surrender is signed and the Axis troops surrender to the forces of the British Field Marshal Alexander, and consequently the Allies occupy Milan, Turin, and Trieste, and the war in Italy is over. While the Italians obtained a negotiated peace, Berlin did on this day surrender unconditionally to the Red Army, now completely in control of the city. The 3rd of May, 1945. Patton's Third Army has split Germany in half. Early May 1945 was an eventful time in Europe, with what would subsequently become historical events taking place almost daily. On the 3rd of May, on Lüneburger Heide in northern Germany, Field Marshal Montgomery receives German envoys, suing for peace and accepting the German surrender of Holland, Denmark, and northwest Germany the following day. Also on the 3rd, Patton's Third Army has split Germany in half, effectively stopping all resistance. In reality, there is only cleaning up to be done, but the Allies are not prepared to take any chances until total and unconditional surrender has been achieved everywhere. The 5th of May, 1945. German forces in Holland, northwest Germany, and Denmark surrendered. All German forces in Holland, northwest Germany, and Denmark had surrendered on the 4th of May, 1945, and on the 5th, the 5-year occupation of Holland and Denmark is effectively over. In Denmark, the country celebrates, whilst members of the resistance take key positions to prevent any independent German actions. Though the defeated Germans were largely left alone, collaborators and sympathizers were quickly being rounded up, and many ugly scenes followed. Individuals that had supported the German war effort were dealt with by the re-established authorities, but sympathizers, particularly women, were left to the population's wrath. The 8th of May, 1945. The war in Europe is over. On the 7th of May, 1945, Admiral Dönitz had no option but surrender, and his representative, General Alfred Jodl, signed an unconditional surrender of all German forces. Germany's full surrender took effect 1 minute past midnight the following day, the 8th of May, after a second signing in Berlin with Soviet participation. The United States and British governments declared the day VE Day, Victory in Europe. The sacrifices, deprivations, and enormous human sufferings and losses would impact on the world for decades, but on this day, the victorious and liberated countries celebrated the end of the most horrendous war the world had ever seen. The 19th of May, 1945. Last Japanese resistance on Luzon in the Philippines ends. Allied troops had landed on the Philippine island of Luzon on the 10th of February 1945 against fierce Japanese resistance and faced a long and bitter campaign before the island could be secured. Manila had succumbed on the 25th of February, again after serious fighting, and the Japanese had, like the Americans 2 years earlier, withdrawn to the area around Clark's airfield, Bataan, and further afield. The mopping up operation on Luzon was hard and costly for the Americans, as it was the Japanese military tenet not to surrender. To become prisoner of war was the ultimate shame. But on the 19th of May, all Japanese resistance had ceased. The 1st of June, 1945. Japanese retreat on Okinawa. Ever since the middle of April 1945, American forces on Okinawa, led by General Simon Bolivar Buckner, had battered the Shuri Line in a remorseless and colossal bombardment, trying to break through the fanatically defended Japanese line. The Americans knew that the Japanese suffered horrendous casualties, but their own losses were also mounting as they had to kill every single Japanese in their path. No surrender. On the 1st of June, the Americans were finally close to a breakthrough, but their operation was hampered by the onset of torrential rain. The Japanese commander took full advantage of the weather and began to withdraw his surviving forces to the south, where they prepared to make a last stand. The 14th of June, 1945. U.S. breakthrough on Okinawa. On the 14th of June, 1945, the Japanese forces on Okinawa had prepared themselves for the last stand as the U.S. 10th Army relentlessly pushed forward. The Americans set about the grisly task of breaking into the Japanese positions, again having to kill or disable every soldier in their way, as surrender was not an option. Finally, on the 17th of June, the Japanese garrison had been split into 3 encircled pockets, and it was hence impossible to mount any coherent or organized defense. Despite their precarious situation, the Japanese commander, Ishijima, was not prepared to surrender, and had all the intentions to fight to the last man and the last bullet. 16th of July, 1945. First atomic test. In August 1939, Albert Einstein had sent a letter to President Roosevelt describing the possibilities of using nuclear fission in weapons development. The Manhattan Project was established in 1942 under the scientific leadership of J. Robert Oppenheimer, with the aim to design and construct the first atomic bombs. At dawn on the 16th of June 1945, the first test explosion was carried out at Alamogordo in New Mexico. The energy released from this explosion was equivalent to the power of 20,000 tons of TNT. The Americans had developed a weapon that forever would change world politics and the balance of power. The 6th of August 1945, atomic bomb is dropped on Hiroshima. The Manhattan Project had started its work on developing an atomic bomb in 1942. If and when to deploy this fearsome weapon was clearly one of the most difficult decisions President Roosevelt had to face, but the mounting carnage in the Pacific eventually resulted in a green light. On the 6th of August 1945, a B-29 bomber, the Enola Gay, dropped the first atomic bomb on the Japanese city of Hiroshima. The results were devastating. As many as 100,000 people were killed by the bomb, called Little Boy, and thousands more were severely injured and were to suffer and die from radiation burns in the years to come. The 8th of August, 1945, the Soviet Union declares war on Japan. During the last day of the Yalta Conference, it had been secretly agreed between President Franklin D. Roosevelt, Prime Minister Winston Churchill, and Premier Joseph Stalin that the Soviet Union would declare war on Japan 90 days after the end to hostilities in Europe. Consequentially, on the 8th of August 1945, the Soviet Union declared war on Japan and invaded Manchukuo on a 1,609-kilometer front in a campaign that involved 76 Red Army divisions, and Joseph Stalin expected, in return for this further involvement, to receive the Kuril Islands, the whole of Sakhalin, and control throughout Manchuria. The 9th of August 1945. Atomic bomb is dropped on Nagasaki. More than 100,000 people had been killed when the first atomic bomb was dropped on Hiroshima on the 6th of August 1945. It had been the hope that the Japanese government wouldn't be able to accept this level of civilian casualties and surrender, but no word came out of Tokyo. As a consequence, a plutonium bomb named Fat Man was dropped on the city of Nagasaki on the 9th of August, only 3 days after the devastation of Hiroshima. The death toll was again horrendous. 40,000 civilians lost their lives in the atomic blast, and further thousands were to die or suffer severe physical traumas over the years ahead. The 14th of August 1945, Japan capitulates. The Second World War was a war fought to its final conclusion. It could be claimed that there was surrender, but no capitulation. The Germans fought on until the Red Army was literally on top of the bunker in Berlin, and the Japanese would linger some 8 days after the devastation of Hiroshima before finally surrendering on the 14th of August 1945. It is true to say that Japan was ready to surrender a few days earlier, but it was conditional on the Emperor Hirohito retaining sovereign powers. This was unacceptable to the Allies. Only unconditional surrender could be accepted, and further Japanese cabinet meetings finally made them cede to the Allied demands. 2nd of September 1945. Japan signs the unconditional surrender on the Missouri. General Douglas MacArthur, designated Supreme Commander for the Allied powers, received representatives of the Japanese government on the quarterdeck of the battleship Missouri, anchored in Tokyo Bay, on the morning of the 2nd of December 1945. When the Japanese Foreign Minister, Mamoru Shigemitsu, signed the formal surrender documents, World War II officially came to an end, having lasted 6 years and 1 day since Adolf Hitler ordered German forces to attack Poland. 56 nations had been involved, and more than 50 million people lost their lives. 15th of October 1946. Göring commits suicide while awaiting execution. Hermann Wilhelm Göring, Field Marshal, Commander-in-Chief of the Luftwaffe, and the second most powerful man in Germany, died, like the decidedly more honorable Erwin Rommel, aged 53, at his own hands. Göring had surrendered to U.S. forces in 1945 and was tried, with other German leaders, for war crimes and crimes against humanity by the International Military Tribunal at Nuremberg. After conducting his own defense with some eloquence, Göring was found guilty on all counts and sentenced to death by hanging, but he poisoned himself on the 15th of October, 1946.